Morning, everybody. I want to make sure that nobody panics. I understand we were momentarily out of caffeinated coffee, but we have some more on the way, so don't panic. I'd like to welcome you to the 2015 University Forum on Teaching and Learning. My name is Patrick Plush. I'm Associate Vice Provost of Learning Enhancement and Director of CLEAR. And this event is brought to you by CLEAR, our Center for Learning Enhancement, Assessment, and Redesign. At CLEAR, our mission is to support faculty in their teaching role. We're a one-stop shop, whether you're teaching online, face-to-face, or anywhere in between. And just by a show of hands, how many people in the, well, let's say ever, have worked with CLEAR in some capacity, whether it's in G-Step or using Blackboard or any training? Great. Coming to this event, anybody? Okay, wanted to get all the hands up. That was just a meager attempt at that. So I just drove in this morning from Dallas. I don't live in Dallas, I live here in town, but I came back from a conference of the Texas Distance Learning Association. And been there the last 2.5 days, and it's like being with family. It's an organization we started here in Texas 20 years ago, and we collaborate really closely across institutional lines and system lines even. It's fantastic, but it reminds me of the occasions like this when we get to come together, come out of our departments and our academic buildings and academic homes, and we have some gifts from other institutions here as well, and take time out and focus on some things that are important to us. In this case, it is teaching and learning. And we have a particular lens we're going to use for that today, and that is analytics, or the way that we can use the things that we know about our students or could find out to help transform their lives, to help change our teaching practice and do a better job. And making those connections, some of them are mental connections and many of them are personal connections, the ideas that others have that you can use. And we're going to explore some of those today. We have a couple panels, largely faculty, some staff on those. We also have a thought leader with us today. And it's Dr. George Siemens. And he grew up, or was born in a small town in Mexico where you learned that you had to be connected to other people to survive. It was part of the social fabric, and you connected to others to make sense of the world. But it also had its limitations. It was a small town, so it was a closed network, and there was information that would have been helpful that they didn't have. And that has influenced his life, and he originated at something called the Connectivism theory. And he'll probably mention that or weave that in some way to today's presentation. But from his small town beginnings in Mexico, he traveled northward, far northward, to Canada, where he worked at both the University of Manitoba and the University of Athabasca, working as both a researcher and a thought leader. He was on the front edge of the MOOC wave, and not just pushing lots of content out and people self-serving it, but the Connectivist MOOC, where you build knowledge together as part of a community. It's not decided externally and kind of broadcast to you. He also has expertise in visualization, analytics, more generally open education, and we're really thrilled to have him with us here today, because what we know about connections is the quality of your life is basically a product of the quality of the connections that you make. And those are the connections with information and knowledge and how you use it, but also the personal connections. And those two really influence your path through life. So events like this are opportunities to make both those kinds of connections. And so I would like to, one more thing I want to tell you about George. He most recently settled somewhere in between Mexico and Canada. He is at the University of Texas at Arlington now, so we're very lucky to have him so close. He founded the LINK Research Lab, which is the Learning Innovations and Networked Knowledge LINK Lab, and is doing great research there. Some of the folks that work for him are students at UNT, doctoral students, and he's got a number of connections in the room. And so we are very happy to welcome today, and please help me, Dr. George Siemens.
Well, good morning, and I want to say a particular thank you to Jane and colleagues for the invitation to spend some time with you this morning. I'm going to be talking about something that's gaining an awful lot of attention, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for techno-determinist reasons, which isn't necessarily that great. But it's this idea of analytics and the idea of how do we use the data that's being generated as we go through our daily lives, whether it's personally or whether it is in our learning activities, but how do we use that data to better improve learning for ourselves or as academics, learning for our students, or as a system, just the success overall with our students. It's not really much of a surprise that analytics are gaining substantial interest in the higher education space. I would argue that the idea of learning analytics, or perhaps more broadly, the idea of data science is a similar point today where computer science was in the early 1980s. Namely, it's something that a lot of folks are paying attention to and talking about, and a growing number of universities are starting to offer either master's or doctoral programs that have a specific focus on data science. So it's a different lens in which to view and understand the world around us. So what I want to talk about today are a few specific elements, namely the why, the what, and the how of analytics. And I want to start with the why of analytics. And not necessarily, you've probably heard the common idea that it's the velocity and the volume of analytics or of data that we're generating that drives the need for analytics. And that's a common argument that you'll get in folks who are selling you an analytic product, whether it's software such as SAS, or whether it is Tableau, or even just the database that underpins, or the support that underpins the access and the utilization of analytics. So I think most of us are aware, though, there's a mess of data. We're having a hard time staying on top of it, and that does present a challenge. And that's a relevant point, but I don't want to take that particular route. Instead, I want to focus on the idea of why is it that as academics we should be paying any attention at all to analytics. And I think the argument is broadly framed around the obligation that the education sector has to a society. And by that obligation to a society, we have an obligation to individuals. The U.S. currently is experiencing income divide and inequality economically that is amongst the highest in history, starting to exceed even what existed in the late 1920s. And so as such, really, we need to look at formal education, which now is a critical component for successful employment. But this education system should be one that enables access and opportunity, not one that actually prevents it. And what we're seeing today is the exact opposite. While most leaders, politicians, university leaders, business members in society would acknowledge that a good education is critical to moving across the various strata economically that exist within society. It's a fairly well-known fact. It's almost accepted as gospel, I think, in many cases. If you want to improve your lot in life, so to speak, the number one way to be able to do that is through some level of education. Unfortunately, what happens, though, is the number one determinant of your ability to get an education is now your socioeconomic status. So the image that you have on, and if anybody wants the slides, I'll share them with Jane, and all the resources and the articles and the citations are in the notes section of it. But so this particular report looked at, for people who are by income quartile, how are they doing in terms of achieving bachelor's degrees? So in 1965, if you were the bottom quartile, you were sitting at around 22% of likelihood that you would actually get a degree, whereas by 2015, it's sitting at 21%. So basically, if you're the poorest of the poor in society, you've actually had a slight decrease in your ability to get a degree. So the interesting paradox we're faced with is to move through various strata of life economically, you need an education. However, the number one determinant of whether you will get an education is actually your current economic lot in life. So in contrast, if you look at the top two quartiles, they've moved from 26 and 55 up to nearly 100% success for students at the top quartile to 51+% chance of getting a bachelor's degree. That's a substantial challenge, and it's one that universities have an obligation to address, and we're not doing it well. Another aspect that underpins the need for analytics in education relates to employment and what's happening in the employment market. So in this case, these are the states with the highest level of employment. We're looking at only 25 years ago. And at that stage, the number one areas of employment were manufacturing across, that's the blue, across the vast majority of states, and the second area is retail, which are the red states that you see. There's the odd one, such as accommodation and food services. But by and large, the economy of the U.S. at that time, as defined by number one employment, or the top employers in those regions, were manufacturing and retail trade. Now let's jump forward about 20-some years, and we look at 2013, and all of a sudden the industries with the highest employment by 2013 is healthcare and social assistance. So the states that have changed, there's been some manufacturing states that are still primary, some that are still primary in retail, and some in accommodation and food service. But the vast majority of the economy now in terms of top employment relates to the healthcare sector. So we've seen a 20-year period, which is about half the working life of an average American citizen, less than half actually, but we've seen a complete change in the employment sector. That's also supported by what's happened in terms of the broad economy as a whole, in terms of where are people finding jobs. So in the US right now, less than 15% of the population is working in traditional production labor. If you would have done this 100 years ago or so, you would have had the flip. The vast majority of the economy was agriculture or production-related work, a very small portion of the economy related to transaction or interaction jobs. Even in an economy like China, which is very heavily reliant on production, you're still seeing less than 50% of the overall economy is defined by jobs of that nature. So we're left with this reality that education's critical, education's unaffordable for many individuals. The economy is changing and iterating so rapidly that to even be competitive economically or to find a job, you need some level of education. And just a quick point before I move on, I think from a university end, we really need to rethink our relationship with students. I mean, right now we talk about a 4-year relationship with learners, and I think it's going to be a 40-year relationship going forward, where we might have a student for 2 years to get them at a certain level of education, but they go into industry, they come back, they take online courses while they're working, their career is upended as periodically happens due to automation or whatever else comes along. And then as a result, the individuals will come back, spend another 6 months or a year in the university system. So and the economic potential of a 40-year relationship with a student far exceeds the economic value of a 4-year relationship. So I think that's a mindset that we need to think about in terms of what does that mean and do. And that's reflected as well in the changing student profiles. So in the US right now, less than 50% of the students fit the traditional model of a full-time student higher education. They're typically students who are doing a range of things. They might be taking a part-time course load while they're working. They may have been in industry for a while and they've returned back to the university system and so on. But that's only part of the story. The more consequential aspect is that as a whole, the higher education system and our student profile is dramatically diversifying. So we are starting to see now that the population that enters the university sector now favors women significantly over men in almost all fields. We're also starting to see as a whole, in a society, the percentage of learning is increasing. So certain regions like Israel, Canada are approaching 60% post-secondary achievement by their population. Other regions in Europe, United States, are in the 40+% range of individuals that are achieving some level of post-secondary credentialing, and that's just continuing to grow year after year. That has huge implications because if you're educating 15% of the population, you likely have the best and the brightest, the most motivated. Once you start educating up to 50 and 60% of the population, you probably have a few reluctants. They're not there because they like learning, they're not there because they like universities. They're there because they think it's a pathway to a degree, or to a job, I should say. So the degree translates to a job. And so from that perspective, we have the idea of a student is no longer a singular narrative. It's instead a range of different profiles, and that means as a university, there's a growing number of services and support services that become more critical to ensure that this particular population continues to be successful. All of this then presents us with some interesting challenges in addition to making sure students are successful, but we also have some challenges around enrollment and how we address enrollment because our population is shifting quite significantly. And so in order to address these changing student demographics, we have to start thinking differently about how we relate to them, the kind of services that we provide, the kind of value they get when they're with our system. So one example, some of you may have heard of these terrible things called MOOCs. And there was a recent report actually released last week at MIT Harvard report, and what they found, because initially when MOOCs hit the mainstream, they were viewed as being something that would replace and challenge universities. There were individuals like Teresa Sullivan, University of Virginia, that were actually dismissed by the Board of Regents because she wasn't moving fast enough in response to MOOCs and technologies that were coming on. Now, the board, after a really neat public fiasco, ended up rehiring her, and she's with the system now. But the general point is that at that stage, MOOCs scared a lot of senior admin, they scared a lot of officials. The University of California system, or California as a whole, the state, ended up wanting to use MOOCs as a key strategy in reducing tuition, and the list goes on. So MOOCs were going to do everything. They were going to raise our kids better than we were, make our toast, do all those wonderful things. But then the MIT report comes out and says, you know what, actually, it's not doing any of those things. MOOCs are instead, essentially, a supply-side answer to decades-long demand-side increase in learning needs. People needed different types of learning, different opportunities. Knowledge fields were changing quickly. Universities, even with continuing ed departments, weren't reaching into mainstream society. So while the learner has changed significantly over the last 30, 40 years, the university model of who we think we're serving hadn't changed much. And the MIT study basically revealed, yeah, these people taking MOOCs are individuals that are in mid-career stages. They might be faculty, they might be teachers, and they're taking MOOCs as a way of improving themselves. An interesting segment is senior citizens who are engaged in learning and learning activity and MOOC-related type of work. So just the sense that in a knowledge age, guess what? The most natural and most consistent thing we need to be doing is learning. And so that's reflected as well. Yesterday, LinkedIn acquired Lynda, which is sort of an online learning company for discrete skills and so on, for only $1.5 billion. So if you get on it quick, you can still get on that gravy train. Just get your company started fast and you'll be good. So all of this then gets us to a context. So I'm really trying to set the why of learning and where learning analytics fits into this. The future then of the university system, something that we're all grappling with and trying to make sense of, is one that I think we have to understand: how are people interacting with information? What are they doing with information? How is information being created? How is it being shared? How is it being validated? Because the higher education system of tomorrow will essentially track, or lack of a better word, mirror what's done with information today. This isn't new. Library of Alexandria came out in this context. The Academy, the Lyceum came out in the same context. Gutenberg, eventually public libraries, classification systems, the Linnaean taxonomy, all of these came from what was being done with information in a particular era. And so we can expect the same thing. If we want to understand what will UNT look like in X number of years in the future, a question or a way to get at that question is to say, what are we and what are our students doing with information today? Because the way they interact with it is the kind of model that we will need to support as a university system. So today I think it's fair to say that most information, at least, is it's open, it's distributed, it's scalable, it's socially created, validated, and generated, it's self-organized, it's adaptive. I mean, throw your buzzwords at this thing, but essentially information today has a different architecture than it's had in the past. And that architecture of information is one that will alter and realign successful institutions with that current model. What does this mean? Well, many of us have probably taught or been involved in a simple learning experience that looks a bit like this, especially at undergraduate level. It changes more at your graduate and postgraduate work, but broadly speaking, you've got your faculty, you've got the content that's part of a body of knowledge that you need to communicate, and you've got your learner. The learner has to consume and master that. Today we've seen something that's essentially a shift to networks, and that looks a little bit more like this, where we have still that relationship is there, so I don't mean to diminish the role of faculty and the need of faculty. In fact, I'll say quite directly that my goal is that technology will make learning more social and more human than it has been for the vast majority of our students. So rather than technology making learning automated and lifeless and soulless, it'll actually make it more engaging and more valuable and more personable. So now we instead have, while we still have that core relationship, students are able to access information, they're able to view lectures. The person that you talk about in class, they're able to go and watch an actual YouTube video of that person lecturing. I mean, pretty obvious kind of stuff, but these are experiences that should change how we think about our teaching practices. You also have students that very easily can connect with learners from around the world and engage with individuals who are pursuing similar topic areas. One course I'm teaching right now, it's a doctoral course in advanced research methods, and the students, basically it's layered on top of a previous course. It's done in The Landing, which is a platform that's built on ELG, so basically it's Facebook in a box, in a very rude way to say it, but that's what it is. So you have the ability to form groups and so on. But we kept the archaeology chronology of the discussion from previous years, so students are actually interacting with the ghosts of students past as they're posting on their comments and interacting with them. So it's just this sense that you are not the only teacher anymore. They have access to previous resources that have been shared and created. They have access to videos. They have access to resources online. And that changes our relationship quite significantly. A second thing that's done as we shift to networks is that we're starting to see the top of this particular image is the articulation that most of us have, and this is what most learning design models are based on, which is you figure out what do you want to do, you create your outcomes and your objectives, you push people through the system, and you have assessment and so on. And it's not that this is a bad system. It's just that it's a system that's mismatched to the information and knowledge needs of learners today. So there are certain contexts where this system works very well. So one example I've often used is, let's look at culinary arts. I mean, it's been quite a while since we've found a new species that we can barbecue. And so as a result, culinary arts is a fairly stable field. A few things have changed, but by and large, it's the same thing. On the other hand, computer science blows up, data science blows up, and the traditional textbook process can't even keep up with what's happening in data science and other fields. So what's happening instead, so there's your traditional sequential course, which is terrific. We need that in many fields, and you certainly need that at a base learning level. When you're, by base, I don't mean like immoral. I mean like at a basic level of learning where you're trying to understand a topic. But then you have a secondary level, which is the networked area, where students engage in this idea of building personal learning connections, engaging with one another, but they're moving back and forth. Our students today then are going to be moving in and out of our courses, back into their personal learning structures, back into our course content, back into their own learning experience. So we have to somehow, going forward as a university system, blend adaptive, personalized, social, self-organized learning with the traditional need for us to achieve or help our students achieve competence in a range of topic areas that we expect them to have when they graduate. Now, some systems, and this is where you're thinking, wow, that's great, George, you talked to us for 15 minutes and you still haven't gotten to analytics, so now I will. So a few things have happened in this regard that make this a little bit more consequential. There's been a group of publishers, platforms as well, that have started to look at this idea of using analytics to personalize the learning process. So Newton and Smart Sparrow and Pearson, McGraw-Hill, all very moral, high-standing organizations that are starting to serve the personalization needs of your learners. Now, what this does, and there's more hype than reality behind this, one of the difficulties is, this is where I'm transitioning to learning analytics, is that many of these are black box scenarios. Like, I don't know what Pearson does that causes a recommendation to be activated for the next learning resource or the next competency. But I need to know as an educator. And so if we're going to go forward as an educator, we either have to academically get up to speed on what's happening in the analytics space and understand how recommender systems work, how prediction engines work, how the adaptive process and the granularity of adaptation, how that works, because if we don't figure it out, we're going to outsource that core competency to a group of vendors. Now, I'm not anti-working with vendors. I mean, everything in this building, everything in this room was created by a corporate entity, more or less. And so it's a great partner, but it's not a great lead when you're in an academic relationship. The university has to be the lead in this system. And one of the reasons is that we have to build our model of teaching and learning on research and research evidence. We can't just sort of randomly make stuff up and move forward with it without being able to make it available to the broader community to validate, interrogate, and ensure that those results can be duplicated. So a few things in this regard is that we really want to move past the idea of teaching students basic low-level knowledge, which a lot of recommendation systems are doing well, because just naming things is what I would call, low-level knowledge, where you're essentially engaged in calling something and saying that is a chair. That's like basic vocabulary. Where it gets interesting is where you move from identifying in a foreign language what a chair means to writing a poem in a foreign language. And analytics and recommender systems right now are more or less focused on helping you name the chair. They're not moving you to the point of using the knowledge concepts to write a poem. And so we want to move to that. Now, there's a few examples that are starting to get there. So you've got things like a granularization of assessment, so badges, and the growth of alternative assessment approaches, but none of these are really available for mainstream yet. There are some folks now, because in the ed tech world, you're successful when you create a buzzword that others use. So now I've been hearing this thing called nanodegrees a lot. Nanodegrees is a Latin term that means certificates. I mean, we've been doing this for an awfully long time. But anyway, if you use nanodegrees in your terminology over the last year or two, you should repent, because, I mean, the certificate example, I mean, that's what they are. You can't just rename something and think you invented it. So the fastest growing form of credentialing actually have been certificates, or nanodegrees, I guess. Over the last 30 years, there's been a huge increase. And part of the reason is because this form of credentialing is tightly aligned with what's happening in the labor market. Now, not all of education is about the labor market, as I mentioned, but if you're educating 60% of your population, a greater portion of those students are in it for a job rather than for personal satisfaction, the way you would be if there's maybe 15% of the market or so on. Also, a lot of folks are interested in competencies and competency-based degrees. It's getting a lot of recognition, even though there are very few examples. So right now we're buying and we're living on hope. And in terms of what we're going to do with competency-based education. There are some promising indications, but we haven't yet been able to make the systemic transformation. That leaves us then with knowledge in pieces. We're getting information and ideas and concepts everywhere. There was a recent as in 25 years ago, report that Annenberg did that looked at what happens when students, in this case they look at Harvard graduates to evaluate what do they know about a basic concept like seasons when they graduate. And they found, of the group they invented, 21 out of 23 could not explain why we have seasons from a scientific perspective. And the reason is, students move through the system without being asked to make their learning transparent, because our assessment, which is connected to our teaching, is what we use to evaluate them. And at no point were they asked to explicitly draw out why we have seasons. When they were asked to, the Earth was doing some crazy stuff going around the sun. It was spinning and doing loops, and it was doing figure eights. But this is how a group of intelligent folks, the brightest of the brightest in the world, had misunderstood a core concept, because we had pushed them through a system that served our assessment needs rather than move them through a system that served their learning needs or that served the scientific foundation of learning. It's going to get worse, because right now we have a system where, on the one hand, I mentioned earlier, we still have the faculty who we hope know what they're doing, the content and the student, but now that student is a click away from a lot of bad information. Or worse, the difficulties of knowledge coherence exist in the spaces between. So that means you watch a TED Talk on topic X, then you go read a Wikipedia article, and then you might hit an academic article. The prospect of error is dramatic between each of those spaces, because that's where the knowledge isn't harmonized and isn't coherent. And we get, and if you have a chance, look at the Private Universe paper or the video that by Annenberg Medium that really gets at what exactly that looks like, or why these kinds of errors occur. Knowledge in pieces, which presents us with this particular problem, and that's essentially that the world is a big data problem. The learning world is a big data problem. So we need analytics for all of the things I just mentioned, everything from the economy changing to the types of students entering the university are changing, to the fact that learners are learning in a different way than they have in the past, in a networked way, and that process of learning is injecting uncertainty, confusion, misunderstanding, knowledge in pieces into the lives of our students, and we need to find a way to make and create coherent learning experiences. All right, the what of learning analytics. So a few of these points going forward, it'll get needlessly complex with small text on the screen and some of the images. So like I said, the slides will be available if you'd like to have a look at it. So one of the things that we've been looking at, or are quite influenced by, is this idea of Pastures Quadrant. And so Pastures Quadrant is this idea that in education, when we're conducting research, when we're involved with scientific activity that involves social systems and social processes, we need to do a better job of making it basic research that advances a field, but simultaneously has direct impact. So the general idea is there's a few areas of research and investigation that just serve advancing knowledge. This is important stuff, theoretical physics. This is the kind of thing that may take 20, 30, 40 years before it has a commercially viable output. But there's also some research that's actually just basic applied work. So it's not that it's advancing knowledge in particular, but it's taking what is known and sort of applying it into solving a different problem. We'd like to be, at least the work that we're trying to do with Link at UTA, we'd like to be at that use-inspired but basic research space. So Pastures Quadrant. We want to be there where we're advancing basic understanding of a domain and the science of learning. By the same account, we want that to cash out very directly in what happens in classrooms and what happens in the lives of our learners. This is one of these diagrams that I meant. I just wanted to put up there because I like colors. And so we recently finished this report. I think is going to be released on Monday, but we did a large analysis of what do we know about blended online distance education. What does the literature say? And so basically we went through a series of processes. The first, red and blue, where we looked at different libraries, different resources, manual journal searches. We ended up with 339 unique studies, meta-studies in particular, that we were looking at. So it was a meta-study of meta-studies, enabling the next person to do a meta-meta-meta-study a few years down the road. We just want to contribute to that. And then we looked at, what does this say about these different spaces? I mean, what do we understand about blended? What do we understand about online? And what do we understand about distance learning? Like, what, from the literature, if you were to say, yes, this is solid. This isn't somebody's idea. This isn't Newton coming in and saying, hey, you guys should do this because it works in our system. This is solid research that's been validated and moved through a system. As a result of going through this, we created something that looks like this, which we're calling, from a scientific perspective, or from a learning sciences perspective at least, the elements that we need to understand when we're designing digital learning that meets the needs of learners. And again, like I said, small font, yes, and we're basically looking at what impacts the content, the instructor, the learner, what about the system, the institutional adoption, the strategies that are related to it, the media selection and use, and a range of other activities. Now, none of this is here just to give you insight. What I'm trying to emphasize with this is that analytics have to be tied to the history of quality learning sciences research. So analytics right now, the way that they're being presented by organizations that are providing learning analytics services, is essentially like a cold start field. Like, guess what? This is what's happening. And we're trying to emphasize we know an awful lot more about learning than we're already doing in our systems. And as we start doing learning analytics research, we have to do a much better job of connecting our questions to things that have already been fairly definitively answered in the literature. So with that as a backdrop, we started in 2010, a group of us got together and created a group called Society for Learning Analytics Research, or the LAC conference. We just had our fifth conference at just outside New York a couple of weeks ago. Those of you that are interested, we have an open journal for articles, and we've got about 5 years now in the ACM digital library, 5 years worth of conference proceedings. So it's a field that has moved from really not existing to one that is drawing a significant number of researchers. And we had one of the contacts at NSF come by to talk to us about future funding. And learning analytics is a huge area of research for them for future funding. So it's an area they recognize that data will influence how we do our teaching practices. And this is a process, again, as I mentioned, it's not cold start. So essentially it means when we're doing learning analytics work, we're trying to collect and use data to optimize or improve the quality of a learner's experience. And there's a flip side to that, which is the impact of the organization, but ultimately there needs to be some way that we take what happens from that data in terms of an actionable insight, so that there's some way to make an improvement. But we do that against a bit of an important constraint. And so this is one that Douglas Bowman, a former designer at Google, came across. So he said, you know, we were at Google, we couldn't decide between two colors or two shades of blue, so they tested 41 shades of blue to see which one performs better. So simple A/B testing. Now, for him, this was a soul-destroying experience. He was a designer. This was his field, his passion. So this reducing everything to a quantitative assessment is like the sword of Damocles sort of hanging over a teacher who's felt some response and interaction and engagement and some intuitive sense of what they're doing being replaced by an algorithm. We don't want to go there. Instead, we want to go to something that looks a little bit more like this, where the impact of analytics in this field will be one, it'll add a research layer to what anyone does in any classroom, any kind of an activity. And that research layer will give us insight into the processes that students use as they go through our curriculum. If you've taken these 4 courses, which, in terms of possibility for successful completion, is most likely for your profile to be the best course for you to take next. Because there could be a difference between taking calculus or taking physics in terms of your chance of staying with the program. Or it could be something like, based on the network configurations of students in a classroom, who does a student with your profile have the best chance of succeeding with if you're socially connected with someone else in a group project? So it's those kinds of insights that we might not be able to see as educators, especially if we've got 30 or 40 or 500 students in a classroom, but they're relevant. Also, the idea of personalization, which I've talked about a bit, is certainly growing in interest and significance. It's this idea, can we create a personalized pathway for each student? Can we make sure that if all of you were in this room and you had, this keynote was done, it would be delivered to you one-on-one, but where you could ask questions directly and clarify and be based on your profile rather than one keynote for everyone. Other things, I don't want to go into great detail in each of these, but I just want to emphasize everything from how the organization understands itself. So this is more academic analytics or business intelligence, which is how do we improve our functioning as a system, whereas learning analytics is about how do we improve the success of our learners and the quality of our teaching. They're related because what you do at an academic analytics side will determine how you support your faculty, which will determine how students ultimately succeed as well. And another aspect that's I think quite interesting is the use of analytics enables increased competitiveness with peers. So if you have a system in a region that is able to move 20, 30% more students to successful graduation due to effective use of learning analytics, then you have a strategic advantage, competitive-wise, state reputation as well, over your peers in the same region who don't use analytics to move those same learners to success. So this is what it looks like organizationally, and this is already happening in your system. The bottom-up part. So a lot of folks in classrooms are using analytics, are asking questions about analytics, and are, whether it's something as simple as a browser plugin to do some social network analysis, or whether it's something more complex, such as getting a hold of data and discourse data, whether it's in a threaded discussion forum or otherwise, and starting to understand the cognitive development of a student by analysis of the data. So these are some things that are already going on, and this is bottom-up work. And bottom-up work is great. You can't do analytics mandated from top down. There's a few systems that have done a terrific job, University of Michigan being amongst the best, that have done a nice job of fostering a bottom-up approach to analytics and are adding a top-down systems-wide approach. And the reason you need top-down is all of your intervention strategies, from if you identify a student as at risk of dropout, how do you intervene? And all of those strategies require coordinated systems level support. Do you do an automated email? Does a faculty member contact them? Do you, especially if there's been a sudden change because it's the changes that matter. So a student's been a very quality, solid student, and all of a sudden year 2, there's a dramatic change in attendance and their grades. There's something wrong. And that something wrong should be met with some kind of a response to assist the learner and ensure that they continue successfully in that program. Now, of course, as some of you probably feel at certain stages, you're starting to enter privacy concerns and privacy areas. But I just want to emphasize that effective learning analytics require system-wide top-down support, resource allocation, well as bottom-up classroom level impact to be successful. What it looks like as it matures over time, though, is something like this. And that's where many universities are right now, probably sits at your bottom left, which is essentially they're aware of some of the data they have. The institutional reporting folks and the institutional research folks, they actually have a tremendous amount of data and very valuable data that's not being utilized sufficiently. But this is where many systems are, is they're aware of analytics. They maybe have, oh, we've talked to Civitas, or we've talked to some analytics provider. They're at that stage. A few have already signed on. But that's the aware and the experimentation end. They're at the early stages. There's, I would say at this point, maybe 1 or 2 systems that come to mind that are at the organizational, student, faculty level where analytics are being deployed in an effective way with quality dashboards for students, for faculty, with cross-system integration of data sources. So it's not just an LMS, but you might be using a range of other data sources to try and understand and manage a profile of the learner. I haven't seen a system yet, other than some for-profits that say they've made this change but don't provide access to the data. But I haven't seen a system yet that has gone through this systemic transformation, which is where you change as an organization. You do some things better socially because you're doing a lot of things better with data and with technical system, which means that your teaching practices have changed to better allow you to spend time with those students who most need your help. Sector transformation, again, that's a pipe dream that might be about 5+ years away as systems as a whole start to improve and do a better job of data sharing across systems and so on. So that's a bit of background in terms of the what of analytics, in terms of some of the process and the aspects that are involved. This section, surprisingly for some of you, is even more boring as we turn to the what, or the how of learning analytics. Like, what is it that we're doing when we're engaged in the learning analytics process? Looks a little bit like this. So on the one hand, you have a series of data sources, and these data sources can be from everywhere. Student information systems, which is very helpful for background data, for socioeconomic data as well, to help identify which students might be at risk. Learning management system, use of university cards, you could be using student success systems, you could be using social media data. Again, as I mentioned, there's some privacy issues and so on. But the data here is essentially anything that you collect about any student at any time. This is then moved into something that looks a bit like a data repository, repository. It likely won't be one single data store. It'll likely be multiple, but there are certainly ways to be able to exchange that data and use that as you're building your success models. Then the big issue that comes out of this is, what are the questions that you're trying to solve? Like, learning analytics should be driven by important questions related to learning or related to organizational performance. So we're looking at things like, what about the impact of social networks? Or what about student preparedness? If we take a group of students and we give them 2 weeks worth of orientation before they come to university, do they succeed better than students who don't? Because the first segment, there's big dropout issues there. So how do you impact that? Also look at pre-university profiles. Can you determine in advance? There's a study, an article that was done in New York Times called Who Gets to Graduate, which was based on the University of Texas at Austin system, where they were identifying, before students got to the system, what are the factors that influence certain students not succeeding. The short answer is, as I stated earlier, if you're poor, you've got a good chance of staying poor, because the education system isn't structured for you, because you don't have the support systems in place. A lot of students, this was my own experience as a student. When I first moved to Canada from Mexico, my parents were very conservative, and the higher education, literally in their eyes, was evil. It was a sin. So we were required, before we left Mexico, my mother had to promise my grandmother that they would not let us go past grade 6 for schooling, because I guess our souls were okay until grade 6, but grade 7, something went wrong. And so, I think it's called puberty, actually, now that I think of it. But what they, and this isn't, there's a lot of students who have that, meaning that when you get to education, it's not just that you don't have the support structure that helps you succeed. It's that you have a family environment that strongly pushes back at you for even going to university. Why are you wasting your time? Get a job, do something. So these are the challenges that individuals face, and so as with pre-university profiles, effective analytics, we can better prepare and scaffold and onboard students that need that kind of support. And then it splits up to these two elements that I mentioned earlier, which is learning analytics, which is faculty, learner focused, and academic analytics, which relates to administrative and state reporting. Now this model, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want to wrap up in a few minutes for questions, but this is roughly what the data loop looks like from collecting analytics. So everything from how do you get it, to how do you store it, to how do you clean it, because getting the data and storing it's the easy part. Putting it into a usable state that's ready for analysis, that takes a lot more work. This is typically done by a data team, meaning that it's not just a single person. When I was at Red River College in the late 90s, we had a computer guy, and it was a guy. But he did everything. If you had a problem with software, he would help. If you had a problem with your network, he would help. If you had a problem with your hardware, he would help. There was one person. Well, those of you here, I'm sure, are well aware, you don't have that one computer person anymore. So an analytics team requires somebody who has a data background or data science background. It likely requires a programmer. It definitely requires somebody who has strong pedagogical awareness of the social processes of learning and understanding of the literature. It requires administrative support. So you can't just say we're doing learning analytics and have one person be in charge. It really needs to be a team-oriented approach. And then, as I've already mentioned, the tools and the techniques that you're using become critical. And then ultimately, you can do the best job possible with analytics, but if you can't put it into a functional shape that the end user can understand and make sense of without being a statistician, you've failed. Because ultimately, the experience of the person who's going to use it is what's critical. When this is done well, I think you cash out at a change in how we interact with students. And what that means is, first of all, there's a project I'm working on now, this idea of a personal knowledge graph, which is much like a social graph, but it's essentially, what do our students know and how do they know it? What are their learning mindsets and how do they get there? A lot of systems, from LMS providers to learning analytics providers, are trying to make this a locked-in thing that's a part of their system. So your profile as a learner, your student's profile is in that system. We want it to be an open system where it's something the student takes with them. If you go to a new university, you can expose those elements to Blackboard that are relevant to that course, or to Canvas, or to Desire to Learn, or to whoever. But you need to own your own learner profile. So you end up then with something where what you know, whether you did it through formal and informal learning, and what's the architecture of knowledge in a field, and then that would determine your degree or qualification. Another way to look at it is this way. Here's what you know, these are the topic areas of stuff that you know, and then this is how close you are to achieving success in those areas. So that means you could go to a university and you expose your knowledge graph to the university. Keep in mind, we're now talking about a 40-year student, not a 4-year student anymore. You expose your knowledge graph, that sounds very crude. 50 Shades of Grey, kind of, you know, you expose your knowledge graph. And as a result of The university then has the ability to say, oh, you're this close to getting your degree in this topic area. Is this of interest? This will be relevant, especially when we're rapidly changing degrees and moving into new subject areas, where we go in and instead of taking 4 years to get competence in a field, we might take 6 months because we don't have to duplicate or the redundant learning isn't there. I'm going to pause there for questions and comments, reactions. I think we got 10 minutes left, so I'm not sure if mics are available or not, but just yell. Oh, there's somebody lifted a hand. There's one there. I think mics might be forthcoming. Oh, good. So there's a gentleman up here, this table to this side.
1, 2.
Sorry, right over here, Jane.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Thank you very much for your insightful analytics approach. I'm really worried about our education from the point of view that we teach pigeonhole subjects. Analytics is helpful in giving us data, but synthesizing that data is what the data is good for, and that's where we get the benefits. Our courses, you mentioned knowledge in pieces. How about putting the pieces together? I find that we teach, you mentioned math and physics. They were born together. That's what Newton did. Somehow or another we teach different subjects. And the people who teach math or learn math do not really are experts in applying math, using it. What is it good for? I'm worried about the fact that we don't synthesize our education. The students learn language of a given subject and then relate it to the language, the same subject taught in a different area. And the concepts are the same, the language is different. So the question to you is, analytics is great. How about synthesizing analytics?
You're making very important points. Edgar Morin did a paper in the late 90s on 7 lessons for complex future regarding knowledge. And he made a very similar point, which is that the university system, through the creation of silos, essentially creates disconnected knowledge structures on the part of our students, which means even though knowledge is an integrated, cohesive whole, we fragmented it and made it isolated individual elements. And pulling that together and synthesizing that is a critical challenge. I don't know what role analytics will play in that space, though, because it's a systemic and organizational challenge. As long as we have faculties where you learn topic X in this faculty and topic Y in that faculty, it doesn't matter what we do with analytics. It's a learning design and a teaching and a systemic issue in terms of how faculties are structured. But you raise an important point. I think some systems, there's a prospect that as we do more with competency-based learning, which then has better integration across different fields, so it doesn't matter which space you necessarily learned it in, that might be one opportunity. Some of the activity that's going on now with active learning and engaged learning, experiential learning, you go to a place like MIT, for example, where first-year physics students don't listen to a lecture anymore. They're involved in a series of problem statements in a lab environment where they're working with objects and understanding how they work, and the faculty comes by and engages with students on those. Ideally, it would be nice if we had team-taught courses as well. The one diagram I had earlier which said, you know, we don't just have the faculty-content-learner relationship, but we have peripheral experts, we have learners from different fields and so on. But yeah, to solve complex problems, we need integrated, nuanced approaches. So basically I'm saying, great point, don't have an answer. Other questions or comments? This gentleman here. How do you cost justify a team teaching approach? Well, there's, that'll depend a lot on the system or the institution. So I wouldn't necessarily cost justify it myself. I would reach out to a colleague at a different university whose work I found interesting, and I would say, hey, I'm teaching a course, I got a group of 25 students, do you mind, you know, doing this together? Do you have a group of students as well? And then they would say, yeah, I do too. Well, why don't we just kind of share our classes? We'll get them involved. So I'm still doing my teaching, and you're doing it as well, but we're able to sort of get our students connected and engaged together. One of the early experiments with MOOCs did exactly this, which was it made the teaching practice open so whoever wanted to could join in and be connected with it. I had a student, for example, in the first course I taught that she took the course with me, but it counted for credit in her doctoral program because, so it's this idea of you teach teach globally but accredit locally. And so she took the course with me, but she went back to her institution, provided a paper to her advisor, and she got credit for 3 credits for one of the courses that she was taking. So I think the network technologies and the social tools that are available to us enable team teaching with a little bit of creativity without necessarily an amplification in costs. Now, anytime you have a system that relies on the creativity of 1 or 2 individuals, you lose the ability to duplicate that when you try and scale it up systemically. So somewhere along the line, some administrator will have to come across the cost structure of team teaching. But my interest right now is we have the tools and the technology with a bit of creativity. We can give our students that experience without cost. Question here? Well, this is one of those questions that it's, because there's so many elements up in the air right now that it's hard to say this is what it should be. Some things have to settle. I mean, it's like 2011, MOOCs were going to be everything, but we needed better data and better input and better results. And then as these things settle, we'll have better insight on how to go. The perspective I would see with that, though, is first of all, the labor market is in a fair degree of upheaval as a whole. If you have that kind of an upheaval, I think it's more important that you look at what are the kinds of competencies that individuals will need to function well in a complex, adaptive, changing environment. And then you end up with this idea that it's less about specific training. It's less about, can you turn on Windows 95 and write an email? It starts to become more about, can you use technology effectively, or can you continue to learn as new technologies become involved? So I think the transition then, which is what universities have always been suited for. Ideally, we've been about the development of frames of minds that allow individuals to engage with uncertain and unknown phenomena in an adaptive way. A lot of the technical colleges are more focused on, can you turn on a computer and write an email this way? It's an important part of the system, but it will change for them as well. But I think in our case, we have to really look at what are the employability skills that individuals require in a global, network, technologically driven economy, and then to start to develop content for that on one level. On the other level, we also need as a university system, and this is where maybe I've been involved in humanities and liberal arts too long, but on the other hand, we also have to make sure that we understand what does it mean to be a human in a technology world, because there are things that computers won't do, and there's also things that we need to be aware of. So for example, when I sit down and start working on a particular project, or I open my laptop, the moment I open it, there's a lot of things waiting for me. There's an email, there's a tweet, there's a this, there's a that, there's a text or whatever else that comes in. So then it starts to become important that we look at what are the mindsets of learning that students need to have. And if you look at just mindfulness literature, for example, this idea that we do intentional contemplative work, mindfulness literature is fairly comprehensive in terms of the impact of intentional focus on health fields, on mental health, anxiety, depression, on physical health recovery. People who practice mindfulness recover more quickly post-surgery and so on. So we have to start looking at, great, now that we got all this technology, suddenly a university's mandate isn't just to teach people things, it's to teach people how to be. And so I would say more and more classes should start with, all right, sit down, get your crap together. Why are you here? What do you want to do? Focus on it. Like, understand your reason for being. And it's the ability to develop those attributes in the part of our learners, which means that we start to look at things like what is an optimally functioning mind and how does one get there in order to be best able to learn. Does that mean that we put away our computers sometimes? We do away with our phones and so on. Those are the kinds of things that we need to teach instead. All right, I'm at the top. Oh, so one question here. Sorry, feel free. I got a minute. Right.
And big shifts, I think of UNT as a very big shift. It's hard to change that. Do you have recommendations on how you can
That's a great question. Max Planck said science advances one funeral at a time. And so that should be your strategy. No, on a serious note, it does require, like the technology is the easy part. Buying Civitas software is the easy part. Getting your data in a database is the easy part. Getting a teacher or a faculty member to engage differently with students is a hard challenge. And so if you're deploying learning analytics, and it's a great point you're raising, you need to spend as much time looking at the social process behind it, the teaching practices, so it's more of a change management strategy rather than just simply creating a vision. Well, thanks very much for your time. Top of the hour. Hope you enjoy the rest of the event.